The smell hit Chaplain Robert Kellerman before he even reached the door. It wasn't the familiar stench of death he'd grown accustomed to in 3 years of war. This was different. Antiseptic mixed with decay, like someone had tried to clean up something terrible and failed. Major Graves stood blocking the corridor, his face pale in the dim light of the liberated camp. "Father, I'm ordering you. Turn around. That ward doesn't exist in any official record." Kellerman's hand was already on the rusted handle. Then maybe it should. Manila, Philippines, April 23, 1945. The war in the Pacific was dying, but it wasn't dead yet. Chaplain Robert Kellerman had been with the 6th Army for 27 months, long enough to think he'd seen everything war could do to the human body and soul. He'd given last rites on lady beaches while machine gun fire tore through palm trees. He'd held dying boys who called for mothers they'd never see again. He'd walked through the smoking ruins of what used to be neighborhoods, stepping over bodies that looked like they'd been arranged by some mad artist. But nothing had prepared him for Camp Santo Tomas, and especially not for what lay behind the door. Major William Graves didn't want him to open. The camp had been liberated 6 weeks earlier in early March, when American forces rolled into Manila, after some of the bloodiest urban combat of the Pacific War. Santo Tomas had held over 3,000 civilian internees, mostly Americans and Europeans caught in the Philippines when Japan invaded in 1941. The newspapers back home had run stories about the joyous liberation, the tearful reunions, the triumph of freedom over tyranny. What they hadn't reported were the secondary facilities, the smaller camps scattered around Manila that held different kinds of prisoners. Military prisoners, women who'd been nurses, aid workers, resistance fighters, women whose names appeared on no Red Cross lists, whose families had been told they were missing, presumed dead, women who'd been useful to their captors in ways the official histories would never want to acknowledge. Kellerman had arrived at the camp on April 20th, 3 days before the confrontation with Graves. He'd been reassigned from his infantry regiment to provide spiritual support during the massive repatriation effort. Thousands of former prisoners needed processing, medical care, documentation. The Army had set up a whole bureaucracy just to handle the logistics of getting these people home, fed, healed, reunited with families who might not even know they were alive. His first 2 days had been routine, if anything about war could be called routine. He'd heard confessions from soldiers struggling with what they'd done and seen. He'd counseled former prisoners wrestling with survivors' guilt, rage, the impossible task of returning to a world that had moved on without them. He'd written letters for men whose hands shook too badly to hold a pen, and he'd prayed over bodies that had held on just long enough to see liberation before giving up entirely. On the 3rd day, he met Private Catherine Brennan. Kate was 24. A nurse from Boston who'd been part of the Army Nurse Corps stationed at Sternberg Hospital in Manila when the Japanese invaded. She'd spent 3.5 years in captivity, first at Santo Tomas with the civilian internees, then moved to a smaller facility that nobody seemed to want to talk about. She was thin in a way that suggested her body had been eating itself for months, her eyes too large and a face that had forgotten how to trust anything good. She'd come to Kellerman's makeshift office, a corner of what used to be the camp's administration building, and sat down without being invited. For 5 minutes she said nothing, just stared at her hands folded in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles had gone white. "Father," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what do you do when you know something terrible but everyone's telling you to forget it? When forgetting would be easier, safer, better for everyone except the people who can't forget because they lived through it?" Kellerman had leaned forward, keeping his voice gentle. "You tell someone who'll listen, someone who won't let it be buried." Kate's laugh had been bitter, almost a sob. "That's the problem, Father. The people who should listen are the ones doing the burying." She'd told him about Ward 7. According to Kate, the main Santo Tomas facility had been relatively well documented. Red Cross inspections, however limited. International observers, however restricted. The Japanese had maintained at least a veneer of following the Geneva Conventions for the civilian internees, knowing the world was watching, knowing they might need to answer for their treatment someday. But 6 miles east, in a former tobacco warehouse converted into an auxiliary medical facility, there had been no observers, no inspections, no veneer. Ward 7 was where they'd taken the women prisoners who had medical training. Nurses, mostly, but also a few doctors, pharmacists, even a veterinarian who'd been doing missionary work when the war started. The official story was that these women were being used to provide medical care for other prisoners, a humanitarian gesture that showed Japanese respect for the healing professions. The truth was something else entirely. Kate had been transferred there in late 1943, after a Japanese medical officer named Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka had reviewed the records of all prisoners with healthcare backgrounds. She'd spent 18 months in Ward 7 before being moved back to Santo Tomas in March of 1944, thin and silent, and different in ways she couldn't articulate even to herself. They were testing things, she'd told Kellerman, her voice flat, affectless like she was reading from a report. Treatments for tropical diseases, surgical techniques, drug protocols. They said it was for the benefit of prisoners, that we were helping develop better care. But the patients, Father. The patients were prisoners too. Women who'd been told they were sick, who needed treatment, who trusted us because we wore nurse uniforms and spoke their languages. She'd described procedures that made Kellerman's stomach turn. Experimental surgeries performed without proper anesthesia to test pain tolerance. Deliberately induced infections to study disease progression. Drugs administered in doses that Dr. Tanaka knew were dangerous, just to document the effects. And through it all, the nurses had been forced to assist, to hold down patients, to record symptoms, to clean up the aftermath. Some of us refused at first, Kate had said. They stopped feeding us, locked us in cells, beat us. After a while, you do what you're told because the alternative is dying, and you tell yourself that maybe if you survive, you can testify someday. You can make sure people know what happened. Where is this Ward 7 now? Kellerman had asked. That's why I came to you, Father. It's still here. Not the warehouse, they evacuated that before the Americans arrived, but they brought some of the patients back to Santo Tomas, to a sealed section in the old hospital building. They're still there, dying probably, and Major Graves won't let anyone near them. That conversation had been on April 22nd. Kellerman had gone immediately to find Major Graves. William Graves was a career military doctor, 48 years old, who'd seen action in the First World War, and had spent the years between wars building a respectable practice in Philadelphia. He'd been recalled to service in 1942 and had spent most of the Pacific War running field hospitals, treating everything from bullet wounds to tropical parasites, to the psychological fractures that came from too much combat and too little hope. He was competent, dedicated, and absolutely unwilling to discuss Ward 7. Chaplain, I appreciate your concern, Graves had said when Kellerman confronted him in the hospital administrative office. But this is a medical matter, not a spiritual one. The patients in that section are receiving appropriate care under quarantine protocols. There's nothing for you to worry about. Private Brennan told me what happened in that ward, what Dr. Tanaka was doing. Graves's expression had hardened. Private Brennan is a traumatized former prisoner who's been through hell. Her perceptions may not be entirely reliable. We're providing her with psychiatric support. So you're saying she's lying? I'm saying she's confused. War does that to people. You know that as well as I do. Kellerman had felt his jaw tighten. I want to see the ward. That's not possible. Why not? Because I'm telling you it's not possible, Chaplain. I don't need to explain my medical decisions to you. Those patients are under my care, and I'm not going to have every chaplain and reporter and curious officer tramping through a quarantine zone because they heard rumors. What are you hiding, Major? Graves had stood up then, using his height and rank like weapons. I'm not hiding anything. I'm protecting patients who've suffered enough, and I'm protecting this army from a scandal that would serve no purpose except to undermine everything we've accomplished here. Now I'm ordering you to drop this, comfort the living, bury the dead, and leave the medical decisions to medical personnel. Is that clear? It should have been clear. Kellerman was a chaplain, not an investigator. He had no authority to countermand a major's orders. The smart thing, the obedient thing, would have been to walk away, to trust that Graves knew what he was doing, to focus on the hundreds of other people who needed spiritual care. But Kellerman kept thinking about Kate Brennan's eyes, the flatness in her voice, the way her hands had shaken when she described holding down a screaming patient, while Dr. Tanaka made careful incisions and took detailed notes. He'd gone looking for Corporal James Wong. Jimmy Wong was 26, born in San Francisco to parents who'd immigrated from Guangdong Province in the 1920s. He'd grown up speaking Cantonese at home and English everywhere else, had studied linguistics at Berkeley before the war, and had been recruited into military intelligence specifically for his language skills. He'd spent most of the war translating captured documents, interrogating prisoners, and serving as a cultural liaison between American forces and the various Chinese, Filipino, and other Asian populations they encountered. He'd been assigned to Santo Tomas to help process the documentation left behind by the Japanese garrison, to interview local witnesses, and to translate the medical records that had been hastily abandoned when the camp was liberated. Kellerman found him in what used to be the camp commandant's office, surrounded by stacks of papers, folders, ledgers, all in Japanese. Jimmy looked up when Kellerman entered, his expression tired but alert. "Father, what can I do for you?" "I need to know what's in the medical records from Ward 7. Jimmy's expression had shifted, become guarded. "That's classified, Father. Major Graves gave specific orders that those documents are restricted. Have you read them?" A long pause, then quietly, "Yes." "What's in them, Corporal?" Jimmy had looked down at the papers on his desk, then back up at Kellerman. "Father, if I tell you I'm disobeying a direct order, I could face court-martial. And if you don't tell me women who were tortured in the name of medical science are going to die in a sealed ward, while the Army pretends it never happened, what does your conscience tell you to do?" Another pause. Then Jimmy had stood, walked to the door, checked the hallway, and closed it. He'd returned to his desk and pulled out a folder from a locked drawer. "Dr. Tanaka kept meticulous records," Jimmy had said, opening the folder. "Every procedure, every drug dosage, every patient reaction, it's all here. Experimental surgeries without anesthesia, induced infections with malaria, dengue, typhus, drug trials using compounds that were known to be toxic. He documented everything like it was legitimate research. How many women? The records show 73 patients over 18 months. 32 died during the experiments. Another 21 died shortly after from complications. The remaining 20 were transferred back to Santo Tomas in March of '44, when the Japanese started evacuating auxiliary facilities. Where are those 20 women now? That's the thing, Father. According to these records, they're in the sealed ward here at Santo Tomas. But Major Graves won't let anyone see them, won't let anyone treat them except a small team he personally selected. And he's ordered all of Tanaka's records to be classified and sealed. Why would he do that? Jimmy had closed the folder, his expression grim. Because if this gets out, it's a massive scandal. The American public will want to know why we didn't protect these women. The international community will ask questions about war crimes trials, and some very uncomfortable questions will be raised about what our own military doctors knew, and when they knew it. Are you saying American doctors were involved? I'm saying that Ward 7 wasn't completely isolated. There were supply requisitions that went through American channels in the black market. Medical equipment that somehow made its way from captured American stocks to Tanaka's facility. Someone was facilitating this, even if they didn't know exactly what it was being used for. And now that we've liberated the camp, the easiest thing is to bury it. Classify the records. Let the surviving patients die quietly. Blame everything on the Japanese and move on. Kellerman had felt a cold rage building in his chest. That's not justice. No, Father, it's not. But it's expedient. That conversation had been late on April 22nd. Kellerman had spent most of the night praying, wrestling with what he should do. By morning, he'd made his decision. He was going to open that door. On April 23rd at 0800 hours, Kellerman had walked into the old hospital building and headed straight for the sealed ward. He'd known Graves would try to stop him, had known he was risking his career, possibly his freedom, but he'd also known that some things mattered more than career and safety. Graves had intercepted him in the corridor, exactly as expected. They'd argued. Graves had ordered him to leave, and Kellerman had put his hand on the rusted handle of the door that wasn't supposed to exist. "Major, I'm going in. You can arrest me afterward if you want, but I'm going in." Graves had stared at him for a long moment, and Kellerman had seen something shift in the man's eyes. Not agreement exactly, but maybe resignation. The acknowledgement that some fights couldn't be won. "If you do this," Graves had said quietly, "you're going to see things you can't unsee, things that will haunt you." "I'm a chaplain in a war zone, Major. I'm already haunted." Kellerman had turned the handle and pushed the door open. The smell had been worse inside. Antiseptic and decay and something else. Something that smelled like fear and pain made manifest. The ward was small, maybe 20 beds, half of them occupied. The women lying in those beds looked more like corpses than living people. Skin stretched tight over bones, eyes sunken, bodies covered in scars and lesions that spoke of procedures no legitimate doctor would ever perform. A Filipino nurse was moving between the beds, checking pulses, adjusting thin blankets. She'd looked up when Kellerman entered, her expression startled, then wary. "Who are you?" she'd asked in accented English. "Chaplain Kellerman, United States Army. What's your name?" Elena Vasquez. "You shouldn't be here." Major Graves said no one is allowed. Major Graves doesn't get to decide who receives spiritual care. These women are dying, aren't they? Elena had looked down at the patient she was attending, a woman who might have been 30 or might have been 60. It was impossible to tell. "Yes, they're dying. From what was done to them in Ward 7? Elena's eyes had filled with tears. "From what we did to them. I was there, Father. I helped Dr. Tanaka. I held them down when they screamed. I recorded their symptoms when they begged me to stop. I'm a nurse. I took an oath to do no harm. And I did harm. So much harm." Kellerman had moved closer, keeping his voice gentle. "You were a prisoner. You were forced. Does that matter? They still suffered. They still died. And the ones who survived are dying now, slowly, from infections and organ damage and wounds that never properly healed. And Major Graves wants them to die quietly, without anyone knowing, so the Army doesn't have to answer difficult questions. Will you help me document this? Will you testify about what happened?" Elena had looked at him for a long moment, weighing the question. Then she'd nodded. "Yes. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember their names." Over the next 3 hours, Kellerman had moved through the ward, speaking with each conscious patient, recording their stories, documenting their injuries. Elena had provided medical details, explaining what procedures had been done, what the long-term effects were, why these women were beyond saving. One of the patients was a woman named Margaret Chen, an American missionary who'd been running a medical clinic in Manila when the Japanese invaded. She'd been 42 when she was taken to Ward 7. She was 45 now, and she was dying from kidney failure caused by experimental drug treatments. "I used to pray," Margaret had whispered when Kellerman sat beside her bed. "In the beginning I prayed all the time, that God would save us, that someone would stop what was happening, that it would all turn out to be a nightmare and I'd wake up. But nobody came. God didn't answer. And after a while I stopped praying because what was the point? I can't explain why God allows suffering," Kellerman had said quietly. "I've been asking that question my whole ministry and I still don't have a good answer. But I can promise you this. Your story will be told. What happened to you will be documented. You won't be forgotten." Margaret had smiled, just a little. "That's something, I suppose. Better than dying in silence." She'd died 4 hours later, with Kellerman holding her hand. By the time Kellerman left the ward, he had detailed notes on all 11 surviving patients, photographs that Jimmy Wong had taken with a borrowed camera, and Elena's written testimony describing the procedures performed in Ward 7. He also had a list of names, 73 women who'd been subjected to Dr. Tanaka's experiments with notations about who had survived and who hadn't. Major Graves had been waiting in the corridor. "Are you satisfied, Chaplain?" Graves had asked, his voice bitter. "No, Major, I'm not satisfied. I'm horrified, and I'm angry that you wanted to bury this. What do you think happens now? You write a report, it goes up the chain of command, and then what? You think the Army is going to launch a major investigation in the middle of finishing a war? You think they're going to risk a scandal that could undermine public support just as we're preparing to invade Japan? I think justice matters more than public relations." Graves had laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You're naive, Father. Justice is a luxury we can't afford right now. We need unity. We need momentum. We need the American people to keep supporting this war until it's finished. If this story gets out, all anyone will talk about is how we failed to protect these women, how there might have been American complicity, how the military justice system is flawed. And while everyone's arguing about that, more soldiers will die because the public lost faith in the mission. So we let these women die in silence. We let Tanaka disappear without consequences. We pretend it never happened. We prioritize. We win the war first. Then we deal with justice." Kellerman had looked at Graves, really looked at him, and had seen a man who'd made too many compromises, who'd convinced himself that pragmatism was the same as morality. "I'm filing a report with the Chaplain Corps and with the Inspector General's office. I'm documenting everything I saw in that ward. And I'm recommending that Dr. Tanaka be added to the list of war criminals to be tried after the war ends. Your report will be classified and buried. Maybe. But I'll have done my duty. I'll have told the truth. What the Army does with that truth is on their conscience, not mine." Kellerman had walked away then, leaving Graves standing alone in the corridor. The next 2 weeks had been a bureaucratic nightmare. Kellerman had filed his report as promised. It had been received, acknowledged, and promptly classified. He'd been called into meetings with senior officers who'd explained, patiently and then less patiently, why pursuing this matter was not in the best interests of the Army or the war effort. He'd been offered a transfer to a quieter posting. He'd been warned that continuing to push this issue could result in disciplinary action. He'd refused to back down. Jimmy Wong had been court-martialed for providing classified documents to unauthorized personnel. The charges had been quietly dropped after Kellerman had threatened to go to the press, but Jimmy had been reassigned to a desk job in Honolulu, effectively ending his intelligence career. Kate Brennan had been diagnosed with severe psychological trauma and sent back to the States for long-term psychiatric care. Her testimony had been deemed unreliable. Elena Vasquez had disappeared. Kellerman had tried to find her, to make sure she was safe, but she'd vanished from Santo Tomas one night in early May. He'd never learned what happened to her, whether she'd fled on her own or been silenced by someone who didn't want her talking. The 11 surviving patients in the sealed ward had all died by mid-May. Their deaths were attributed to complications from wartime captivity, malnutrition, and tropical diseases. No mention was made of Ward 7 or Dr. Tanaka's experiments. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka was never found. He'd disappeared sometime before the liberation of Manila, possibly killed in the fighting, possibly escaped to Japan or elsewhere in Asia. His name appeared on no war crimes lists. His experiments were documented in classified files that wouldn't be declassified for decades. The war in the Pacific ended in August 1945, after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world celebrated victory, mourned the dead, and began the long process of rebuilding. War crimes trials were held in Tokyo and elsewhere, prosecuting Japanese officers and officials for atrocities committed during the war. Ward 7 was never mentioned. Chaplain Robert Kellerman continued his service through the end of the war and into the occupation of Japan. He kept copies of his report, his photographs, his documentation, locked away in a personal safe. He told himself that someday when the time was right, the truth would come out. It took 50 years. In 1995, a historian researching American military chaplains during World War II discovered Kellerman's papers in an archive at a seminary in Pennsylvania. The chaplain had died in 1978, but he'd left instructions that his files on Ward 7 should be made public 50 years after the war's end, when most of the people involved would be dead, and the geopolitical concerns of 1945 would be historical footnotes. The historian published a book. It caused a minor controversy, some academic debates, a few newspaper articles. The U.S. government acknowledged that the events described in Kellerman's report appeared to be accurate, expressed regret for the suffering of the women involved, and noted that the perpetrators had never been brought to justice. No formal apology was issued. No reparations were paid. The story made headlines for a few weeks, then faded as other news took precedence. But the names were remembered. 73 women who'd been subjected to torture in the name of medical science. 11 who'd died in a sealed ward while the Army looked away. A Filipino nurse who'd been forced to participate and then vanished. An American chaplain who'd refused to let their suffering be erased. History is full of doors we're told not to open. Secrets we're ordered to keep. Truths that are too inconvenient to acknowledge. Most of the time, those doors stay closed. The secrets stay buried. The truth remains hidden. But sometimes, someone decides that conscience matters more than career, that justice matters more than expedience, that the dead deserve to be remembered even when remembering is uncomfortable. Chaplain Robert Kellerman opened a door he was ordered to keep closed. What he found behind it haunted him for the rest of his life, but he made sure the world would eventually know. He made sure the names would be recorded. He made sure that 73 women who suffered in silence would not be forgotten. That's not redemption, it's not justice, it's not enough, but it's something. And sometimes, in the darkness of war and institutional failure and human cruelty, something is all we have. The story of Ward 7 is a reminder that atrocities don't only happen in places we expect, committed by people we can easily label as monsters. Sometimes they happen in military hospitals, carried out by doctors who keep meticulous records. Sometimes they're covered up by officers who believe they're protecting the greater good. Sometimes they're witnessed by people who want to speak out, but are silenced by systems more powerful than individual conscience. And sometimes one person decides that silence is worse than consequences, that truth matters more than comfort, that opening a forbidden door is the only moral choice, even when everyone is telling you to walk away. Chaplain Kellerman walked through that door. He saw what the Army wanted to hide, and he made sure that decades later, when the political calculations of 1945 no longer mattered, the world would know what happened in Ward 7. The women who died there deserved at least that much: to be remembered, to have their suffering acknowledged, to exist in history as more than classified files and buried secrets. So if you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more untold histories from World War II. Give this video a like if you believe these stories need to be told, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how we remember the uncomfortable truths of war. History isn't just about victories and heroes. It's also about the people who suffered in silence and the rare individuals who refused to let that silence continue.